Well, let's go ahead and get started. It's wonderful to see all of you today, although I cannot see you. I am here joined by, my name is Archie Piatti, and I'm the CEO of the Tahirih Justice Center. You're joined today by Casey Carter-Swegman, who is our Director of Public Policy, and Rachel Sheridan, who is our Senior Litigation Counsel. You're going to hear a lot from them. You'll also be seeing in the chat some notes from Emma Storm, who works in our communications department and is going to be giving you some tips, some advice, some ways to get in touch with us throughout. We welcome your questions. Feel free to use the chat, and at the end, we will try to reserve some time for Q&A. A brief overview of our agenda. We're going to get into, I'll give you a little bit of an update, background on who we are as an organization, the Tahirih Justice Center, and then we'll talk about immigration policy advocacy, child and forced marriage advocacy, and how you can get involved. The main reason we wanted to do this with you today is because we know that the policy landscape facing survivors right now is a little bit confusing. We ourselves are scrambling every day to kind of keep up with things and understand. You all will know that as individuals who work with survivors of gender-based violence or immigrant survivors of gender-based violence, as we do, you will have paid attention to the policy landscape over the last decade and noticed that there's been some yo-yoing. We were in an era where we were responding to deterrence-based policies under the Obama administration. We moved into a heavy enforcement era, and really a tearing down of a lot of the policies that we relied on to help our clients move forward and to help immigrant survivors move forward and get the safety and protection they need. And now we've come into yet another era under the Biden administration of a lot of change. And so what we want to do here is not touch on everything that's going on, because frankly, there really isn't enough time. We want to focus here on a couple of the most sort of timely policy changes, those that have happened very recently. We want to also be able to give you a little bit of a window into what's coming, and then give you some ideas of how you can get involved. And that includes really specific action items that we invite you to take in your organization, whether you're a Tahirih staff member or a member of another organization or a survivor yourself. There are ways that you can get involved and take action, and we want to invite you to do that. So just a tiny bit about Tahirih. Many of you know us already. You work at Tahirih, you know of us and partner with us in your own area of work. We're a national nonprofit organization serving women, girls, and other survivors of gender-based violence. We focus on immigrant survivors for the majority of our work, although in our forced and child marriage work, we do serve others who are not immigrants. Our main goal is to try and end gender-based violence, mostly because we believe that all people should share equal rights and be able to live in safety and with dignity, and that we can't get there if folks don't have very basic needs like access to safety. In this country, as you know, that's hard to come by, especially if you're undocumented, but also if you're somebody who experiences multiple forms of intersecting oppressions or multiple forms of marginalization. Our work really is exciting because it is multifaceted. We provide direct services, including free legal and social services, direct representation to emergency food, shelter, and healthcare to individuals who come to us for support. The reason we do that is not only to help them, but because we do really believe that survivors who are able to access their own safety and freedom are the ones who are best suited to really end the cycle of violence in their own families, for their children, for their loved ones, and also in their communities and in the communities that touch all of us. We also use our experience in that area of direct service to help inform our public policy advocacy. So our attorneys and social workers and advocates are working with clients on a day-to-day basis, elevating what they see are some of the problems in the systems. We know the big issues with the systems, but there are sometimes trends, new things that come up. And so we use that to try to inform our policy advocacy, which we conduct both at a local level or state level, as well as at a federal level. outreach and education and training, we are really trying to make sure that other professionals who interact with the individuals we serve understand not only how they can interact with immigrant survivors of gender-based violence in the most trauma-informed and understanding client-centered way, but also know what we do and what we can provide so they're ready and willing and interested in partnering with us. Now, before I hand off to Casey and Rachel to take us through the policy updates you're here to hear, I want to make sure to remind you that the chat is open for your questions. We are going to try to leave some time at the end and we'll be watching throughout. But at the end, for sure, we're going to take some time and make an attempt to answer all your questions. I also want to make sure to invite you, let us know if you want to hear other topics. So as you're listening, if you're thinking, wow, I would really love to hear more about, X, Y, or Z that they sort of touched on but kept going. If you put that in the chat, we'll make a note and we can do other sessions like this if this is useful to you. All right, with that, let me pass it to Casey.
Thanks so much, Archie. Really appreciate you being here with us today. We know as CEO, you're one of the busiest people, if not the busiest person at our organization. And you were recently in this role of Director of Public Policy. So as ever, super grateful for you sharing space with us today. So we kind of organized this conversation today in terms of all of the moments in a survivor's life where our policy advocacy might help increase their access to justice. And quite frankly, you just heard from Archie, but really the work that we're doing with immigrant survivors, we're in their lives at almost every point on their journey. And so we're going to start our conversation today talking about some of the policies impacting survivors' abilities to seek safety along our southern border. And we're going to go from there. And so we're also going to talk about what Tahereh is doing to push back against these harmful policies, some of which you might be pretty familiar with from the news. And so I'm going to invite Rachel to talk a bit about what's going on with Title 42. It's here, it's there, there's lawsuits, there's, executive orders. What's the status of that? And how is it impacting our work and our clients? And then, of course, we couldn't do this presentation today without talking about the recently announced asylum ban rules and what we're doing to push back against that. So I'm going to hand it over to Rachel. Maybe you can talk us through sort of in layman's terms for those of us who are not expert litigation attorneys, what's going on with Title 42, and then we can shift over to the asylum ban.
Thanks, Casey. So I'll start by briefly summarizing the current status of Title 42. The administration has tried to terminate Title 42. A court in Louisiana prevented the first effort at termination. And more recently, the Supreme Court has stayed indefinitely or paused indefinitely another termination effort, which was done by the District Court for the District of Columbia. So now we anticipate that the Biden administration will end Title 42 by a different mechanism. That's expected to happen on May 11th. That was an announcement made by the administration last month. We aren't going to spend much more time talking about Title 42 today because of this new development with the recently announced asylum ban proposed rule. So even if Title 42 ends as scheduled on May 11th, this new development has already shifted our focus. And this is the administration's Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPRM. It was issued just last week, and it so thoroughly curtails access to asylum that our community has started calling it an asylum ban. There are two main elements to this asylum ban: a transit ban and an entry ban. Under the transit ban, survivors will be presumed to be ineligible for asylum if they travel through a country on their way to the US southern border and cannot show that they applied for and were denied asylum in that country. So that would include countries like Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and this rule therefore requires people to apply for asylum in countries that have no functioning asylum system or may have no ability or willingness to protect people from harm. Non-citizens can escape that presumption through the other piece of this rule, the entry ban, if they make an appointment to seek asylum at the border using the CBP-1 app and then show up in accordance with the date and time scheduled through that app. That's part of the entry ban. A couple of months ago, DHS started using this app, and its flaws were immediately clear. It is available in a very limited number of languages, currently only 4 languages. It requires applicants to share a significant amount of personal information, including biometric data. It is unable to discern the facial features of many people of color, and it offers so few appointments that it constitutes illegal metering. So the rule does carve out certain exceptions for people such as unaccompanied children, people who have been pre-approved to seek parole. And then there is another narrow exception which applies to people who can prove that at the time they entered the US at the southern border, they or a member of their family who was traveling with them at the time of entry faced an acute medical emergency or faced an imminent and extreme threat to life or safety, or that they qualify as a survivor of a severe form of human trafficking. These exceptions are so narrow that they are insufficient to provide survivors with meaningful access to asylum. People who cannot satisfy one of those exceptions will be barred from seeking asylum and subjected to a far higher standard under which they may be eligible only for withholding of removal or relief under the Convention Against Torture. The practical effect here of this asylum ban rule will be to slam our doors to the most vulnerable people. People who would remain unsafe in Mexico or other countries that they transit through will be the very people who must wait indefinitely in dangerous conditions at the southern border just to preserve their chance at asylum in the United States. So this rule is so alarming, it has called for an all-hands-on-deck response from the broader immigration movement, as well as those focused specifically on serving immigrant survivors, because that is the most vulnerable population affected by the rule. We at Tahirih have initiated a sign-on letter that we have addressed to the president, noting our dismay and discouragement with this policy. We're also planning to file a formal comment in response to the rule, which will document all of the ways that this rule violates domestic and international law, as well as our moral obligations to protect and provide for those most vulnerable people. This rule, if it goes into effect, will be subject to litigation, and we are likely to be involved in that litigation. And finally, we are participating in a broader immigrant rights movement effort to do a mass comment campaign, and we'll provide you all with an opportunity to be involved in that comment campaign. We encourage you to take action and show that you also disapprove of this effort by the Biden administration to close our doors to vulnerable people.
Thank you, Rachel. I know it's a lot to explain the complexities and the intricacies of this asylum ban. And I think one thing I'd love to also sort of expound upon is that you might be hearing a lot about the exceptions to the rule here, that this isn't a ban because you can claim X or claim Y, but we're talking about people fleeing for their lives, already traumatized, without access to resources, often without access to housing, under extreme stress, and most importantly, without access to an attorney to even explain the fact that these exceptions exist. So for one, how could they possibly know? And even if they did, how could they possibly succeed at making those claims without an attorney that knows the immigration system? And so when Rachel says it's effectively slamming the doors, that's what we mean. It really is a full ban on seeking asylum in this country, wherever you come from and however you get here, which is the letter of the law. And that's why we feel litigation on this will be so important, because just like previous attempts at this kind of ban, this is flying in the face of US law, as well as our obligations under several international treaties. And so if you, again, at the end, if you have any questions about that work and how to get involved, please do let us know. And I also want to just emphasize the reason that Tahirih, like we specifically know how vulnerable this population is because we did original research with Oxfam on the rates of gender-based violence along our southern border and the experiences with gender-based violence, sexual assault, rape, and human trafficking on a woman's journey to the border. And the fact is those rates are incredibly high, and that research is incredibly recent. And so if you're interested in learning more about the hard data that we have outside of our day in and day out work with our clients, we invite you to find our Surviving Deterrence report on our website, and we'll also share it out with folks who registered. And so moving away from the border, because again, as Archie shared, that could be probably an entire presentation in and of itself. We are also advocating for survivors who make it here, who are, working with an attorney, who are seeking status and trying to rebuild their lives. And again, we see systems like Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, the Department of State failing them. There are systemic failures that need to be fixed, and we're working on those too. The policies that would work for survivors of gender-based violence who are immigrants are known, and they have been known. And so we are advocating across those agencies to improve the ways in which they do their work, to improve policies and processes so that immigrant survivors have fair and equal access to justice. Some examples of this advocacy include welcome centers. This is sort of collectively agreed upon by the movement as a pretty clear and achievable proposal where asylum seekers can access legal and humanitarian resources. We're asking these agencies to fully implement a robust trauma-informed policies and practice across their agencies that are interfacing with asylum seekers, because what we know is trauma informs memory, trauma informs how you present to people. And so without trauma-informed policies and practices, folks who would otherwise be very eligible for asylum based on what they've experienced are going to be filtered out. They're going to be turned away, despite the fact that they have a very credible claim. Other recommendations that we're working on: eradicating, of course, racial bias across these systems and agencies. The CBP One App being just one niche example of how racial bias shows up either on purpose or incidentally in the work that these agencies are doing, and that will disproportionately impact immigrant survivors of color. Supporting alternative pathways for processing refugees and aligning our U.S. immigration and asylum policies with our foreign policy goals that seek to promote women's economic and social empowerment, right? So approaching and attacking these issues from all sides so that immigrant survivors have all the options and resources that they deserve. And so we have kind of a big list of things here to talk about. It was much longer when we first drafted this PowerPoint, but I'm going to ask Rachel if you might share some of, beyond what I've already named, the other advocacy priorities that we're working on to improve the lives of our clients as they pursue their legal cases and seek to rebuild their lives here.
Yeah, thanks, Casey. One theme that's come up for us this year as we set our goals for policy advocacy is we're seeing a really severe impact of delay in processing various types of applications on our clients and their communities. Justice delayed is justice denied, as we all know, and that's really something that we're seeing among our client populations. So one of the severe delays that we are working to fight is the delays that appear in the processing of affirmative asylum applications. Under the previous administration, the asylum office was gutted, and many asylum officers have also been deployed to the border instead of processing affirmative asylum applications. That has resulted in extreme delays in processing the classic bread and butter asylum applications from people within the US. What we need is for USCIS to be fully staffed and committed to timely processing. Waiting years and years to find out whether non-citizens have protected status and may win their asylum case exacts enormous costs on survivors who are suffering the daily stress of uncertainty and often also suffer family separation even as they seek to rebuild their lives in a safe place. Just for one example, we have a client, Claire, who was beaten and her life was threatened when she was working to advance women's education and women's economic empowerment in her home country of Cameroon. She made it to the US and filed her asylum application in 2017 and has yet to be interviewed. In the meantime, her husband, her children, and her grandchildren are living in hiding in Cameroon to evade ongoing threats while she awaits adjudication of her application. So because of the urgency of these types of cases, we are pursuing several litigation strategies to try to support our clients who have long pending affirmative asylum applications and who deserve prompt adjudication. Another place where we're seeing delays arise in damaging ways for our clients is in the Operation Allies Welcome program for Afghan asylum seekers. So we have been advocating with USCIS to encourage them to keep the promise that was made to Operation Allies Welcome. The 2021 continuing resolution mandated that Afghan evacuees seeking asylum be interviewed within 45 days of filing and receive a decision within 150 days of filing. This program provided over 70,000 Afghan evacuees with the opportunity to receive expedited immigration processing and avoid having their cases caught up in that backlog of 5 or more years of processing time for the average asylum case. But unfortunately, USCIS is not delivering on this promise of rapid processing. Just yesterday, we learned from USCIS directly that 13,500 Afghan asylum applications are currently pending with USCIS. The cost of those delays is pronounced in the Afghan asylum seeking community, where many asylum seekers continue to pursue family unity and eagerly await their protected status so that they can continue to rebuild their lives in safety and security. I have an example here too. One of our clients worked for a nonprofit in Afghanistan that educated girls and women, and she was evacuated when the United States withdrew, and her asylum application remains pending. She's beyond that 150 days and coming up on the expiration of her humanitarian parole status. In the meantime, she is unable to petition for her family members to support them in seeking safety from the Taliban. So in response to these delays, Tahirih has organized a call to action for our supporters to contact your members of Congress and urge them to keep the promise that we made to Afghan evacuees who are now at risk of falling out of status, losing benefits, losing work authorization, and losing the ability to continue their education and risk living in limbo because of these processing delays. So we invite you to join us and use this call to action, and we'll send that to you either later in this presentation or in a follow-up message after the session. We are also in conversation with allied organizations about a potential litigation strategy to be sure that we can make sure that this administration follows up on these promises that have been made to this important population. So more to come on that front. And then a third area where we continue to see heavy delays is in work permit processing. We are seeing delays of a year or more in processing of work permit applications, with greatest delays appearing in work permit renewals. And although a work permit may seem to some like minor or logistical, the right to work is of course essential to self-determination. While someone awaits authorization or renewal to work, an asylum seeker is likely to lose a job or be unable to secure a job in the first place. Job insecurity leads to housing instability and food insecurity, and the ripple effects of these delays are severe, especially for survivors. We at Tahirih successfully sued the government to hold them to the required processing times for work permits, but even following that successful suit, USCIS is struggling to comply with the court orders to meet those timelines. And we see this cost, for example, in one of our clients, Rika, who timely filed her work permit renewal application while her asylum application was pending, but she did not receive a receipt notice for more than 6 months, and her work permit took nearly a year to issue. In the meantime, her existing work permit expired. She was fired from her job, lost her home, was forced to move into shelter housing, and had to disrupt her children's education. So something that seems small or marginal actually has a tremendous negative ripple effect for a survivor and her family, and can make them vulnerable to various kinds of exploitation. So we continue to advocate for better ways to protect asylum seekers' right to work. Casey, in addition to these advocacy and litigation strategies, I know there are a couple more ways that we're working on advocacy for our client communities. Do you want to talk about a couple more here?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, there's so many ways in which to approach this work and to push for change. And I always just so blown away by all the work that our small but mighty team is doing. And so I'll touch on quickly here the WISE Act, which stands for Working for Immigrant Safety and Empowerment. And some of you, again, might have heard about this. It was introduced in December of last year. This act aims to safeguard and improve existing protections for immigrant survivors in order to help them achieve safety and justice. And we are really excited about this bill. We do know that reintroduction is coming soon. And while there is a lot contained in this bill, I will just name some of the things we're most excited about. This bill would lift the U visa and special immigrant juvenile visa caps, making these programs far more accessible. Speaking of delays, I think, this has been well covered over the many years of the U visa program, but the cap is reached every single year within the first couple months of the year, and there are people waiting 5+ years for their U visa when they are perfectly qualified and approved to have one. And it's simply these caps that stand in the way. And so we are advocating through the WISE Act to lift those caps. They are arbitrary and do not reflect the need. The WISE Act would also prevent detention and deportation of immigrant survivors while their immigration cases are pending. So critical when we know cases are pending for such an incredibly long time, and would also strengthen the confidentiality and privacy protections for immigrant survivors. We have seen a couple instances in recent years where glitches, accidents, tech breaches, you name it, have really encroached on survivor confidentiality within the systems that are meant to protect them. And so we're trying to improve those protections. And last but not least, we are sort of at the forefront of what we are now calling the movement for gender asylum justice. And this is related to naming gender as a grounds for asylum. And just by way of brief background for those who aren't in the weeds of asylum law in the way that our team is, our asylum law is based on the 1951 UN Refugee Convention and the 1967 Protocol. It's designed to protect people from persecution based on specific fundamental traits about who they are, like race, religion, and nationality. But gender did not make that list. The result of the exclusion of gender is that claims involving abuses like domestic violence, forced marriage, sexual assault, and so-called honor crimes are extremely hard to win, even with an expert attorney. Applicants are forced to contort their arguments to fit burdensome and, quite frankly, ever-shifting technical requirements. And as a result, many survivors are facing these prolonged uphill court battles with appeals and deportation back to face further abuse, and in some cases, even death. And so after watching this system fail survivors of gender-based violence for so long, we believe that it's time for the US to name gender as a grounds of asylum. Many other countries have done this. That list is growing, and it's really long past time for the United States to do the same. So we have an entire website devoted to the movement for gender asylum justice. We're excited for the incredible partners from all over the US that have already joined the movement. You can see the list, and we welcome more people to join that all the time.
As many of you might know, another piece of our domestic policy work, which is born out of our direct work with survivors, is advocating for laws that protect against forced and child marriage on both the state and federal levels. Casey, will you walk us through that side of Tahereh's work and what we have in store in 2023?
Absolutely. And I want to be totally cognizant of time and the fact that we want to leave space for questions and answers. So forgiveness in advance to the audience, from the audience, I hope, for how quickly I'm going to go through this. But again, as with most things in this presentation today, all of this information can be found on our website. But just to lay the groundwork for those of you who may not be totally read into the work that Tahereh has been doing since 2011 through the Forced Marriage Initiative, we are working with individuals in the US regardless of status. We work with US citizens, legal permanent residents, those on student visas who are facing or fleeing forced marriage. Forced marriage defined as a marriage where one or both people do not or cannot consent, which typically involves elements of force, fraud, or coercion. We see this as distinct from arranged marriage, as does the US government. So these are not equated. Consent and the multifaceted nature of consent in these instances is really the key here. Child marriage is related to this work on forced marriage. And in general, child marriage is one that involves at least one individual under the age of 18, where Tahereh and other organizations come out on this issue about whether or not every child marriage is a forced marriage is really, something that we feel strongly that not every single child marriage that occurs in the United States involves elements of force, fraud, or coercion. I have spoken to, I have heard from, I think many people know in their lives, people who were fully consenting, maybe mature 17-year-olds who got married and it was not forced. What we know is regardless of whether or not child marriage is forced, it is a bad idea. The majority of those marriages, and I'm talking about upwards of 80%, end in divorce. Often they do lead to the kinds of stress that results in an increased risk of domestic and sexual violence. They often lead to usually the girl not finishing their education, and I'm talking about high school, let alone going on to college. And so the outcomes, whether forced or not, of getting married under the age of 18 are very, very bad. Add being forced as a minor and your vulnerabilities as a child, and we have a whole host of problems that need addressed. And at the root of that is we need to stop allowing people under the age of 18 who do not have legal rights to be married. It's just bad public policy. So briefly on the federal level, there is no criminal law against forced marriage. That is an open question as to whether or not that would help the actual people we're trying to serve. There is also this issue of child marriage occurring through the immigration system, because as it stands right now, there is no statutorily set minimum age for a foreign beneficiary to a spousal visa or a fiance visa. And what we know from the data is that thousands of adult US citizen men, some in their 30s, 40s, have brought over children to be fiancés and spouses in countries where they don't know anyone, where they likely do not speak the language, and as minors have very few rights. This is predatory, it is pedophilia, it is sanctioning and facilitating child marriage through our immigration system and leaving foreign-born girls extremely vulnerable to abuse. And so in that space, we are advocating hard for a federal bill to address child marriage as it's occurring through the immigration system, because it is also affecting minor US citizens who are being pressured to sponsor as well. So it's affecting everyone on all sides. We did have a few big wins in the Violence Against Women Act last year as it relates to forced and child marriage. We got forced marriage defined in VAWA for the first time. And we also repealed the federal marriage defense to statutory rape. And we also got the Attorney General's office to commit to doing an annual report on the disconnect between minimum age of marriage laws across the 50 states and laws against sexual crimes against minors. And that will be really important to getting the federal government to pay more attention to the fact that this is happening in the United States and perhaps energize them to take more action. On the state level, hopefully many of you get our updates from time to time in your emails and are well read into this. But as you know, in all 50 states, our laws on minimum age of marriage vary widely. Since we launched the movement to end child marriage in the US in 2016, there have been a wave of 30 reforms. We now have 7 states that have completely ended child marriage altogether. That might seem like a small number, but those were incredibly hard-fought wins. We have 6 more that have limited marriage to legal adults. And we do have some exciting news that Wyoming is the most recent state as of this week to sign a bill finally setting a minimum age of marriage at all. When we started in 2016, half of the states in the US had no minimum age of marriage, period. Now we are down to 7, and Wyoming is the reason for that. Previously, we had 8 states with no minimum age, and thanks to Wyoming finally setting one, not ideal, it's 16, we want it to be 18. But again, this is a part of a growing movement, and it takes time, and we're always excited to see steps in the right direction. And last, before we sort of open ourselves up for more dialogue with you all, I wanted to also share that this year, Tahirih is leading a campaign to end child marriage in Washington, D.C. And I'm excited about that because that's where I live and that's where I sit. And it's really close to the heart of Tahirih as an organization. And it's the last place where Tahirih has an office where we haven't led a campaign to end child marriage. So you'll see on this slide what the current law allows. It's very lax. We've seen some pretty disturbing data. And shout out to my team who will be having a webinar on Friday to launch the campaign more formally. Partners, interested folks in and around DC are invited to join. It will be our staff along with a survivor advocate, as well as the head of the DC Rape Crisis Center, who we're really excited to have join us.
Thank you so much. I know we have some action items here, but before we kind of walk through what those are and make sure that folks are aware how they can get involved, Casey and Rachel, that was incredible. So much information you got through really quickly. I know that there are probably a lot of questions brewing for folks, and while I give people a minute to go ahead and put a few things in the chat. We had one come up early on from Sasha, and I'm going to use the look at the chat and read it out to you so that I get it right. I think it goes way back to the conversation or the summary you were giving of the proposed rule that we are calling the asylum ban for short. And the question is really, if it does go into effect, will it apply only to individuals apprehended as of the date of the rule or later? Or will it also be retroactive so as to apply to individuals who have been in removal proceedings for years already and waiting on their asylum merits hearings?
Thanks for that good question. The rule as currently proposed will not be retroactive. It will apply to people who approach the border on or after the date that Title 42 is lifted.
And so anybody who's already in the country and who's already going through the asylum process is not under the umbrella of this.
That's right. And actually, this rule also does have a sunset provision. It's anticipated only to be in effect for 24 months. We can debate whether that is a realistic sunset provision or not, but that is how it is currently anticipated to apply. It's just for 24 months after that first date when Title 42 is lifted, which is currently anticipated to be May 11th.
Wonderful. That's very helpful guidance, and thank you for that question, Sasha. If there are any other questions, I have not seen any in the chat, so I'm paying attention. If any come up, I'll be sure to read them out so that all of you have a chance to hear those answers. For those who have not been paying attention to the chat, I'll also point out, Emma shared that you will receive an email after this webinar that will include links to reports and the slides and other things so that you can or the recording, I'm sorry, so that you can rewatch and learn again. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us here at Tahirih. We'd love to help. In the meantime, Casey, would you like to walk us through what some of these action items are?
Yeah, absolutely. And I see that Emma has put a lot of the useful links for these action items in the chat. So grateful to you for that, Emma. Right up top, going again back to that asylum ban, as Rachel noted in the beginning, we are participating in and supportive of a broad call to action for members of the public who are upset about this asylum ban and care about access to justice along our southern border to comment yourselves. And so there is a website that allows you to do that fairly easily. And what we encourage is that you make your comment as unique as possible. So yes, there is stock language, and they make it quite easy for you. The reason that we invite people to comment is for their own personal reasons, right? We want the administration to hear from you directly as to why it's personal to you that people have access to justice along our southern border. So we encourage you to amend, edit, change, add your own voice when you're in there commenting at that link. And beyond that, we have a very specific call to action that we launched a couple of weeks ago on the Afghan advocacy. And again, really calling on Congress to hold the administration's feet to the fire on that promise of 150-day adjudication and decisions on those Afghan asylum applications, just given the devastating impacts of living in limbo for that particular population. And so the link is in the chat, will be shared after the fact, but that's as easy as, again, clicking through, putting in your zip code, you'll get a link to email your representatives. And again, we always encourage people to be inspired by the language we provide, but to add your own voice and edit as you see fit. As ever, if you're like, what emails? I don't receive information from Tahirih yet. Well, then we invite you to join our mailing list. There's lots of sort of unique threads that we provide. You can get any and all of our emails if you love us that much, or you can sort of tone it down to just policy or just forced and child marriage or just broad work. We are on Instagram and Twitter if you're still in that space, and LinkedIn and Facebook. So if you want sort of real-time updates about what we're doing, highlights of our staff and our clients, we really would love for you to follow us there. It's a really sort of in real-time way to stay on top of what we're doing. And of course, for those of you who are in DC or know people in DC who would be interested in lending their voice, lending their support, connecting us to other advocates and youth, who would be interested in our campaign to end child marriage in Washington, D.C., we invite you to reach out to us directly, and we will share. The lead of that campaign is Alex Goyette on our policy team. And for those who are interested in getting more deeply involved in that with us, we will share his contact information.
Thank you so much, Casey. I don't see any other questions in the chat. So what I'm going to do is point everyone to it. If you would like to open the chat, you'll see right now a number of links where you can take action right now in this moment while you're inspired by everything that you've heard just now. And we will sign off a little bit early. I want to say thank you so much to all of you for joining us and listening and being concerned about the future of immigrant, in particular, survivors of gender-based violence, as well as those who are facing forced and child marriage here and overseas. And a huge thanks to Casey and to Rachel for sharing their expertise, their passion, and their incredible, incredible wisdom and knowledge with all of us. I've learned a lot. I hope all of you have as well. And we look forward to seeing you back here for another webinar on the state of policy when it feels timely. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Archie. Bye.